Hi, my name is Karthik Godavarthi and I am the faculty in Anthropology. In this video, we shall analyze the Anthropology Optional Paper 1 which has been given in the recently concluded Civil Service Examination 2021. This year's paper is by and large within the confines of the prescribed syllabus, and the questions are also pretty straightforward, we can say. I'll give you an overview and the specific points that need to be covered in each of these questions. The first question in section A is short notes, and there is a word limit of 150 words and the questions carry 10 marks each, and I'm sure you are aware of this structure. And the very first short note that was given is Animism and deep ecology. Since deep ecology is relatively a recent concept, let me explain to you what it means first. Deep ecology is a concept that emerged in multiple sciences in the recent decades to develop a deeper understanding of the values and beliefs that people hold regarding their environment. This was a reaction to the growing environmental degradation that was happening across the world and the need to revive cultural values that emphasize sustainability and ecological behaviors. Deep ecology is an attempt, you can say, towards restoring nature to its original glory. And according to this particular concept, no one organism or life form, and that includes us, the human beings, has more claims than the other beings in their existence. In fact, all have the right to live, and this right is universal in nature. Having said that, you can introduce your answer by defining what ecological anthropology is, which you know focuses on the relationship between man and his environment, and how culture and technology and other aspects of the human behavior interface with this interaction between the two, man and the environment. The study of deep ecology entails an ethno-ecological approach to understand the values and the worldview that people hold about their environment. These are embedded in the social institutions like religion and cultural practices of the people. And religious beliefs like animism, which was asked in this question, which is an attribution of a living soul to plant or other animal phenomenon, is a manifestation of deep ecology, which is present in many religions, including those especially found in India. As an example, you can quote the concept of Panchabhutas and the revering of the forces of nature in the traditional Indian culture, and more so in a majority of tribal traditions in India. Deep ecology requires an emic view of culture, and this is the view that anthropologists, through their ethnographic research, try to capture. And this view entails understanding the perception that the people have towards the nature around them. And this is the structure you can have when you attempt this particular question. And the second short note that was given was marriage regulations and alliance theory. Now you can introduce this answer stating that understanding the mechanisms for maintaining political order in stateless societies has been a central problem of anthropologists ever since the early 20th century. While the British anthropologists of the time saw kinship systems and descent as providing a foundation for the stable functioning of societies in the absence of state institutions, which is popularly known as the descent theory, which I'm sure you are aware of, it was criticized to have undervalued the role of marriage in maintaining social order and solidarity in the simple societies. The alliance theory, you see, also known as the theory of exchange, is largely the work of the French structuralist Claude Lévi-Strauss and later developed by Rodney Needham and Louis Dumont and other people. You can explain the salient points of the theory, like marriage regulations like incest taboo and exogamy, generating alliance systems. These regulations ensure that the descent groups are involved in a connubial cycle of exchange leading to harmonious relationships between the various descent groups. Alliance theory proposes a functional approach to the study of marriage regulations, especially in simple, non-Western cultures which have unilineal descent systems. And you can use this last statement as a conclusion. And the third short note is again straightforward: historical particularism and Franz Boas. American anthropologist Franz Boas was highly critical of evolutionary school because it was unscientific, unreliable, and based on secondary data. And you should introduce your answer with this criticism. And he proposed historical particularism as a more scientific method to explain the evolution of culture. He maintained that every culture has its own unique history and circumstances, and therefore every culture must be studied from an historical context. And then you can say histories of cultures must be reconstructed on the basis of intensive fieldwork according to Boas, and the methods involving identifying small and well-defined geographical areas with similar cultures and listing out the traits of cultures, which is famously known as the trait listing method, identifying the cultural center and empirically establishing common origins of traits, and finally presenting a consolidated history of the whole area. And Boas says such a historical construction alone will be able to provide a scientific basis for propounding the laws governing the progress of human culture. And you can conclude by mentioning a couple of criticisms to historical particularism, like it failed to provide a clear-cut theoretical approach, or it cannot be applied easily to understanding the complex societies, and it failed to provide the theory which can explain clearly the histories of specific cultures, etc. And the next short note, the fourth one, is the biocultural approach is the hallmark of biological anthropology. Explain. So this is a statement which you are supposed to substantiate through your answer. You can introduce the answer by stating that anthropology is also called the four-field method, having four main branches: sociocultural, biological, linguistic, and archaeological. And biological anthropology is one of the oldest and the largest branches of anthropology, which studies, apart from other things, human evolution and human diversity. And then you can say, however, biological anthropology is not the only science that looks at the biology of the human species. There are other branches, isn't it? Like biology, which also investigates the same aspects that anthropologists do. But what makes biological anthropology unique is the approach of this branch, which discovers and integrates into its theory the complex interaction that goes on between the human biology, the human society, and also the human culture. Human biology and culture have always interacted with each other. They have influenced each other ever since man was evolving. You can give examples like the analysis in physical anthropology, how the biological and cultural factors are integrated, like genetics and marriage regulations, behavioral and physiological strategies and their interaction in ecological anthropology, biocultural factors in demographic behavior, the impact of culture on nutrition, like food taboos, growth, etc. Man, after all, is as much a product of his biology as he is a product of his society and culture. And human nature is complex and it requires a holistic approach, which all the branches of anthropology embrace, and especially so in the case of biological anthropology. And you can use this last statement as a conclusion to this short note. And the fifth short note is thermoluminescence, TL dating. You can start this short note by saying that archaeology is an important branch of anthropology which reconstructs extinct cultures. It can be defined as the location of a specimen in both space as well as time. And dating is an important method to locate an archaeological specimen in time. Thermoluminescence is an absolute dating technique used in archaeology to identify the approximate time a specimen or an artifact was used in the distant past. This is relatively a new technique which is still very much in its development stage, and thermoluminescence is primarily used on ceramics and pottery. It makes use of the fact that heated materials can actually trap energy that is released when these materials are reheated in laboratory conditions. And the trapped energy, I believe, increases over time, providing the standard through which this dating technique works. A piece of pottery heated during its manufacture is heated again under laboratory conditions, and the stored energy is released in the form of visible rays, and the measurement of this released energy indicates how long the energy has been trapped inside the pottery. And because the thermal energy is subsequently released in the form of visible rays, we call it thermoluminescence. Although it is relatively a cheaper technique to dating compared to the other techniques we have, it is difficult to date artifacts using this method because this method entails actually the destruction of the samples that are being tested. And so you can't use it for art, or you can't use it for some of those very rare and precious artifacts. A great deal more work needs to be done actually before thermoluminescence will be seen as a reliable dating technique like radiocarbon or potassium argon testing. You can conclude your short note by mentioning that dating requires drawing accurate data from multiple sources of information, and archaeologists should not rely on any one particular technique. So these are the 5 short notes that were asked in question number 1, and let's move on to question number 2A. And 2A is a 20 marker, and it says, what are the physical and cultural characteristics of Homo erectus and discuss its phylogenetic status. Well, a question cannot be more straightforward than that. And please remember that all answers in paleoanthropology should have a standard structure, and so this one too. You should always begin with the discovery, the ecological background, and the antiquity of the fossil. Then you can go on to explaining the characteristics of the fossil evidence that you are examining, and then conclude your answer by discussing the phylogenetic status. And in this context, the answer should begin with the discovery and antiquity of Homo erectus fossils. They are dated around 500,000 years ago in the Middle Pleistocene. And while mentioning the discoveries, please emphasize the fact that Homo erectus fossils now appear far and wide from Africa, the original crucible of human evolution. And the very fact that Homo erectus fossils are found outside Africa demonstrates the success of cultural adaptations, especially beginning with this ancestor of ours. And important fossil discoveries that you can mention are from Java and Peking, which is Homo erectus pekinensis and Homo erectus javanicus. The physical characteristics should include important points like Homo erectus was the first true hominid. It represents the beginning of a true man. It exhibited all the basic elements of human biocultural adaptive pattern. It used fire, made stone tools, and used even the skin of other animals. You can mention all the general characteristics like size, cranial capacity, etc. And while mentioning the important cultural characteristics, you can say that they were hunters and gatherers. Wild fruits, tubers, and eggs were recovered from the debris. They probably used clothing because evidence of needles made of bone were found in Chaukutian, which is the Chinese site. More sophisticated toolkit the Homo erectus ancestor had compared to his predecessor, which is Homo habilis. And this is probably because Homo erectus had more expanded brain. And the stone tool's core was worked on both the sides for the first time, which is called the bifaces. I'm sure you know this. And these bifaces or bifacial hand axes and cleavers were discovered. And when you talk about the phylogenetic status, you can say that there were no fossils found from less than 300,000 years ago. And there are two major views about the phylogenetic status of Homo erectus. In one view, or according to one view, Homo erectus and Homo sapien represent a single evolutionary lineage through a process of gradual evolution. And that's why people believe that the boundaries between the two are unclear. And few other researchers have generally opposed this view, especially Louis Leakey. He has argued that Homo erectus populations, especially those found in Africa, overlap in time with more advanced Homo sapiens, and therefore Homo erectus cannot be ancestral to Homo sapien. So you have to explain both the views in this particular context, and the phylogenetic implication, you see, can be actually the conclusion to your answer. And question 2b, this is a 15 marker, which says elucidate the concept of thick description of Clifford Geertz with suitable examples. So introduce your answer by mentioning about symbolic anthropology, which views culture as a system of meaning interpreted through key symbols in a society. And Clifford Geertz, with his interpretive approach to analysis of symbols, is a key proponent of this school of thought. Symbols, according to him, are vehicles of culture, and they should be studied for what they can reveal to us about a culture. And he says the analysis of culture should be through thick description, which is the analysis of the whole culture and its constituent parts, the reasoning and the mental processes behind the cultural behavior. A famous example, I'm sure you must be knowing, of thick description is the analysis of the difference between the blink and the wink, which both involve eye movements, but the intention behind them is different. And an ethnographic example from Geertz's own work is the deep play, Notes on the Balinese Cockfight. And this is one of the Clifford Geertz's most influential articles, which illustrates not only the meaning of a given cultural phenomenon, which is the Balinese cockfight in this case, but also Geertz's interpretive approach that sees culture as a set of text or set of texts that need to be read by an anthropologist. And Geertz shows how Balinese cockfight serves as a cultural text which embodies what the real meaning of being a Balinese is. And through his thick description, he showed how it symbolizes the aggression of men, opposition to other social groups, and the representation of social tensions. So, this being a 15 marker, you can be elaborate. You have 3 side sheets that you need to make use of. So, you have enough space to cover all these points in this context. And 2C is again another 15 marker, which is describe the features of early farming cultures and Neolithic of Near East. Well, this is pretty factual and a standard and fact-based question in archaeological anthropology or prehistoric archaeology. You can start by defining what Neolithic is. Neolithic is the state of human cultural evolution marked by a change from hunting and gathering economy and a flaked stone tool technology to an economy based on farming and a technology that included polished stone tools, pottery, and also weaving. And Near East is a geography where farming actually first developed in human history. And the geographical extent of what we mean by Near East actually includes the modern day Iran, Iraq, Turkey, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, and also Jordan. And the earliest evidence of changing pattern to domestication came from the Levant, the narrow east and southern coasts of the Mediterranean. You can explain briefly the Kebaran culture in the Levant and the Zarzian culture in the Zagros highlands. And about 12,000 years ago in the Levant, the Kebaran culture gradually gave rise to Natufian culture. You know, this was asked last year actually. And mentioned some important aspects of Natufian culture. And beginning at about 8,000 years before present, there were fully developed farming villages and small towns in the Near East. And in the areas with enough rainfall, such as northern Mesopotamia, grains were cultivated without irrigation. And that's one of the unique aspects of Neolithic in the Near East. Primitive irrigation was used near the Zagros foothills and also in the Sumerian south. And you can elaborate about this nature of irrigation and irrigation projects that were undertaken. Explain the introduction of pottery and other salient aspects even from the Sumerian culture, Mesopotamia, etc. So you can actually score well if you don't make any kind of factual mistakes in this particular answer. And let's go to question 3A. How do political organizations of simple societies establish power, authority, and legitimacy? So you can introduce your answer by talking about political anthropology as an important branch of anthropology that is interested, amongst many other aspects, a comparative study of political structures in the world, especially the simple societies. The structural perspective in political anthropology started with the publication of African Political Systems in 1940 by Meyer Fortis and Evans Pritchard. And these scholars distinguished three basic types of political systems: the band, the stateless society, and the state. But since 1950s and 60s, you see, the political systems in simple or tribal societies were classified into centralized and uncentralized political systems. And these classifications are primarily based on the locus of power, authority, and legitimacy. So you can explain the different types of political systems like band and tribal political organizations, which are many multicentric types like clan-based, lineage-based, age-grade-based, association-based, and also the Melanesian big man-based political organizations. And then you can move on to the centralized political systems, the chiefdom and the state, and mention their characteristics. And you can give ethnographic examples wherever you can, like Luapula for chiefdom and Hehe of Tanganyika for the state. So you can broadly touch upon all of them and give one or two examples for each of them, and that should be a good answer. And then question 3B, explain the genetic mechanisms of micro and macro evolution. Well, there are various ways in which you can start, but probably one good way of starting this answer would be with Darwin. You know, Darwin saw evolution as a gradual unfolding of new varieties of life from the previous forms over long periods of time, right? But this depiction of evolution is what most of us think is evolution, but it is not. Actually, what Darwin prescribed or what Darwin actually spoke about is the end result of the evolutionary process. These are long-term effects, and these long-term effects of evolution can only come about by the accumulation of many small evolutionary changes occurring in every generation. And then you can say that the contemporary evolutionary biology studies evolutionary changes occurring between the generations and can also demonstrate how evolution actually works. And from such a modern genetic perspective, evolution is defined as a change in the allelic frequencies from one generation to the next. And evolution is an incredibly common phenomenon, and it may occur between every generation for every group of organisms in the world, and that includes the humans also. And over a short run of just a few generations, such changes in inherited traits may only be very small, but if further continued and elaborated, the results can and do produce spectacular kinds of adaptation and whole new varieties of life. Whether we are talking about such short-term effects in one population from one generation to the next, which is called microevolution, or the long-term effects through fossil history, which is called as macroevolution, the basic evolutionary mechanisms are all similar. And then you can explain the factors that bring about changes in these allelic frequencies at both the micro and macro evolutionary levels. And these are called the primary evolutionary forces: mutations, migrations, which are also called as gene flow, genetic drift, recombination. And then you can explain how natural selection and reproductive isolation work on the variations and subsequently produce a variety of species like subspecies, or finally the origin of new species. Since the question is specific about the genetic mechanisms, you should prevail upon the primary evolutionary forces and make a passing reference in your conclusion to natural selection and isolation. And that can be the structure that you can follow for this question. And question 3C, a 15 marker, once again, discuss the salient features of different traditions of European Mesolithic. Another question from prehistoric archaeology. Now, Mesolithic is a transitional period between Paleolithic and Neolithic, and that's the reason why it's named as such, and I'm sure you know this. Now, this stage is not very clearly defined across the world, but it can be found in Europe, the Near East, and also North America. And Mesolithic age corresponded to the warming trend that began after the last glaciation receded. That's about 10,000 years ago. And people lived and hunted in smaller social groups as game animals became smaller, and in some cases the game actually became less abundant. Traditionally, the beginning of food production marks the end of the Mesolithic age. So its length varies in different parts of the world, and that has been a common situation with all the other stages too. And perhaps the best studied Mesolithic period from across the world is actually from Europe. In fact, the term Mesolithic was originally used in archaeology to describe the European remains from the end of the Magdalenian, or the so-called reindeer period. That's about 10,000 years ago, until the adoption of agriculture about 6,000 years ago. And the archaeological sites corresponding to Mesolithic can be found in Great Britain, Germany, Scandinavia, Ukraine, Russia. All these correspond to Mesolithic in Europe. The Balkan Mesolithic begins around 15,000 years ago actually, and in Western Europe, the early Mesolithic, which is also known as the Azilian, begins about 14,000 years ago in northern Spain and also southern France. And in other parts of Europe, the Mesolithic begins by about 11,500 years ago, which is the beginning of the Holocene, and it ends with the introduction of farming, depending on the region, between 8,500 and 5,500 years ago. And Mesolithic in general is characterized by small blades, usually less than an inch, and these are called the microliths. And they were used especially as tips and barbs for the arrows. And these weapons were well suited to hunting the small game of this time. And the northeastern Europe, Siberia, and certain southern European and northern African sites, there was something called as the ceramic Mesolithic that can be distinguished between 9,000 to somewhere around 5,500 years before present. And then at the end of the Mesolithic, the Neolithic features like farming, herding, polished stone axes, and pottery, they start spreading into Europe. And that's when the Mesolithic way of life was marginalized and it eventually disappears. And Mesolithic adaptations such as sedentism, population size, and the use of plant foods are actually cited as the evidence of the transition to the Neolithic or agriculture phase. So that's a kind of an elaborate answer. If you can remember all the facts, these points can be captured in this particular question. And let's go on to the fourth question, 4A, a 20 marker. Elaborate the scope of anthropology and elucidate its uniqueness in the field of other social sciences. I mean, pretty simple. You can start with defining anthropology. You can use any of the definitions, but I would prefer something like Encyclopedia Britannica, which says anthropology is a discipline devoted to a discourse on human nature. And you can say that anthropology is the most comprehensive of all the disciplines that study man. You can explain anthropology as a four-field method to study human nature, which includes the four branches: socio-cultural, physical, linguistic, and archaeological. And say that anthropology is not the only discipline that studies man, but the unique position of anthropology amongst other social sciences lies in this approach to understanding the human nature in a very typical and a peculiar way. And this includes holistic, historical, and comparative approaches to studying man. And explain each one of them in detail. And since it's a 20 marker, there's no harm even if you try to explain each of these themes with an example. And then add other themes of anthropological research that make it a unique discipline, like fieldwork and participant observation, the dichotomy that anthropologists maintain between the etic and the emic perspectives, the case study technique as a part of its research methodology. All these can go into this answer, and you can conclude by talking about anthropology also being a theoretical as well as an applied discipline. And that's question 4A. And 4B is again from the very first topic, mention the major branches of linguistic anthropology and discuss language use in social and cultural settings. Sociolinguistics actually. So define anthropology again and establish linguistic anthropology as one of the four major branches of anthropology. Then define linguistic anthropology as the study of language and speech as social and cultural phenomena. And then the question is saying mention. So briefly mention, probably in a sentence or two, what each branch of linguistic anthropology does. You have historical linguistics, structural linguistics, psycholinguistics, and finally sociolinguistics. And since the rest of the question is on sociolinguistics, elaborate a little more on sociolinguistics as the study of how various social variables influence language use. You can talk of speech communities. A speech community is a group of people having a peculiar language behavior. And a sociolect, the susceptibility of language to social variation. And then you start elaborating on how the various variables like social class, occupation, prestige, age, and gender influence the language use. And for every one of them, if you can give an example, that would be fantastic. And then 4C, this is from physical anthropology. Chromosomal aberrations can play havoc with human body and mind. That's a statement. So explain with suitable examples. Pretty straightforward once again. So you can start your answer by defining chromosomal aberrations and the types of aberrations, structural and numerical. And then you can go on to explaining that both autosomes and sex chromosomes are susceptible to aberrations. Even the slightest variation from the normal structure and the number of chromosomes may result in devastating effects on the normal functioning of the human body as well as the human mind. The structural anomalies are the result of deletions, inversions, translocations, duplications, etc. Since it's asking you to explain with examples in this context of structural aberrations, you can mention the Cri-du-Chat syndrome, the 5p minus, resulting in both abnormalities in body and mind. Explain the symptoms and also do mention that severe mental retardation or intellectual disability that this will cause. And even numerical aberrations like aneuploidy, which are the result of non-disjunctions of chromosomes, especially in the autosomes like Down syndrome, which is trisomy 21, and Patau, which is trisomy 13, can also cause abnormalities in body and mind, isn't it? Including intellectual disabilities. So elaborate the symptoms in these examples to substantiate the statement that chromosomal aberrations play havoc with body and mind. And let's move on to section B. The fifth question obviously is short notes, and the first short note they have asked is human adolescent growth spurt. The adolescent growth spurt, you see, in humans is a rapid and intense increase in the rate of growth during the adolescent state of human life. That's the definition. And that's how you need to begin this answer. It is seen in both the height and weight of the human body. The growth spurt is especially seen in almost all the long bones of the body and other skeletal components. The only exception to this growth spurt is the female pelvis, which continues to show a gradual and a smooth increase in its size until adulthood. And this increase in growth velocity is unique to humans in the order primates. Even man's closest relative, the chimpanzee, doesn't demonstrate it, except the male chimpanzee perhaps showing an increase in its body mass in the post-pubertal phase due to rapid muscle growth. And the human adolescent growth spurt, you see, usually begins around 10 years in girls and around 12 years in boys, with some individual and also population variations in when it starts and how long it lasts. Mention the factors responsible for it, like the hormones responsible for sexual maturation also cause the growth spurt. And the growth spurt is also greater in boys than girls. It normally ends around 18 years for girls and around 20 or 21 years for boys. And the end of this growth spurt normally coincides with the beginning of the reproductive stage of life, the adulthood. And you can also mention that factors both endogenous as well as exogenous, like genetics, nutrition, chronic infections, emotional environment, etc., are also found to influence the growth in general, not necessarily only the growth spurt. And then short note 5b, the losses and gains of erect posture. Well, human evolution is characterized by predominantly two themes, isn't it? Bipedalization and encephalization. You start with that. And while there are more than 30 different hypotheses that try to explain why humans evolved bipedalism, you can say that it is still unclear what actually led to this unique upright posture and gait. Information is still scanty from the fossil evidences that are discovered so far. And this orthogate bipedal locomotion, which entails the upright walking with independent movement of limbs, has both advantages as well as disadvantages. And then you list down some advantages or gains of erect posture, which include obviously the freeing of the forelimbs from locomotion, which has resulted in their evolution into hands, which are now deployed full time for manipulation. And with associated increase in the prehensility and the evolution of the opposable thumb, humans have what is called as the manipulative dexterity. And then erect posture also has an advantage of better thermoregulation of the body. And then biomechanical studies conducted prove that erect posture with associated bipedalism contributes to better energy management and conservation during locomotion. And also erect posture lifts man physically above the ground, and that has given him improved vision, which was an evolutionary advantage in any kind of habitat. We were evolving in the savanna, we were evolving in the open woodlands, and this gave man an evolutionary advantage while he was evolving. Erect posture and its associated changes from the head all the way to the toe had other added benefits like possibilities of even speech and also gesture, because there were a lot of associated changes parallelly happening in the head region too. However, there are certain serious mechanical drawbacks to erect posture. There is a greater chance of injury or prolapse, as we call it, due to exposure of soft portions of the body, especially the groin area. There is an increased possibility of dislocation, especially in the base of the vertebral column and lateral curvature of the spine. There are increasing chances of herniations of the intervertebral discs of the spine. These are what are called popularly as slip discs, which are responsible for sciatica, lumbago, and backspin. And the pressure on the brachial plexus, the network of nerves that send signals to shoulders and arms, result in the drooping of shoulders. And then, of course, the narrowing of pelvis led to vulnerable childbearing in the human females. So these are some of the losses and gains that you can capture in your answer. And that should do, because it's only 10 marker. And then you have 5C, which is race a valid and biologically meaningful concept? So you start by defining what a race is, mention the factors that led to the formation of race, just mention them. Give examples of main races of the world like Caucasoid, Mongoloid, and Negroid, and you don't have to explain their individual features. Then you can speak about how the biological conception of race is redundant because of various reasons. Race crossing is the most important one of them. The intermixture of races resulting in hybrids. And biologically, all humans actually belong to one species, and hence they are not reproductively isolated. Races are biologically open, and humans all over the world are genetically open. And the potential of intermixture is always present, and every race, has an opportunity to intermingle or intermix with the other races. So the so-called pure original races, or the pure races, like the Caucasoids, Mongoloids, and Negroids, they all came into existence once upon a time because of geographical isolation between populations for generations to come, matings restricted to local populations, operation of local environmental factors on these populations, and also the accumulation of genetic differences between them. But the so-called purity of races became redundant once the expansion and migration of the human populations began. Race crossing, became a common phenomenon with the advent of seafaring long time back. And subsequently colonialism, urbanization, industrialization have hastened race crossing. And this is even more evident given the increased pace of globalization today. And with increase in race crossing, race lost its biological relevance, but unfortunately gained a social and a cultural significance, which is manifest in the form of racism. So that should be a broad structure that you can use to prove that race as a biological concept is no more meaningful. Probably it's relevant for medical and pharmacological reasons, but otherwise, the biological concept of a race is by and large a meaningless concept. And then 5D, descent groups. A straightforward question from kinship. Once again, define descent groups. Descent groups are the kinship-based social groups whose members are descendants of a common ancestor. And then you can talk about the various descent groups, lineages, which have common known ancestor. They work on the principles of demonstrated descent. Clans, which are a group of people who are tracing their descent to a common unknown mythical stipulated ancestor. Phratry, moiety, kindred. Kindred is based on bilateral descent. So give examples for all of them. Probably from India you can. Murya Gonds of Madhya Pradesh and the Rabhas of Assam, they have phratries. The Nagas, the Korku of Madhya Pradesh, the Ans of Andhra Pradesh and Todas, they have moieties. Bilateral descent is a characteristic feature of Western societies. So briefly explain all of them in a sentence or two and give examples. And that's a pretty straightforward answer. And the last short note you have, 5E, is the modes of subsistence. Economic anthropology. Subsistence entails the system of practices that are used by the members of a society to acquire food. That's a definition. And like all human systems, you can say a society's subsistence system is intricately linked to other aspects of culture, such as kinship, politics, and religion. Anthropologists identify 4 main modes of subsistence: foraging, pastoralism, horticulture, and agriculture. And foraging, sometimes known as hunting and gathering, describes societies that rely primarily on wild plants and animal food resources. Pastoralism is a subsistence system in which people raise herds of domesticated livestock. Horticulture is the small-scale cultivation of crops intended primarily for subsistence, not for markets. Agriculture, the subsistence system involving the cultivation of domesticated plants and animals using technologies that allow for intensive use of land. And almost every society, you should say, instead of relying on only one mode of subsistence, normally uses a combination of one or more of these strategies into their subsistence practices. And you can conclude by mentioning the modes of subsistence also influence other aspects of the society, like surplus, and surplus in turn influencing social stratification and even the nature of political systems. So this is the answer one can write in the context of this short note. And let's move on to question number 6A, 20 marker. What is acclimatization, and discuss the adaptive responses to high altitude and cold climates. So what is acclimatization? You can straight away start with the definition that it is a process in which an individual organism adjusts to a change in its environment, like for example, a change in altitude, humidity, temperature, etc., allowing it to maintain fitness across a range of environmental conditions. Acclimatization occurs in a short period of time and within the organism's lifetime. And you can differentiate it from adaptation. As compared to adaptation, which is evolution, taking place over many generations, acclimatization is something that is happening within the lifetime of an organism. It refers more specifically to the physiological changes in the body as long as the environmental stimulus is present. and the changes associated with acclimatization are usually reversible when you take away the stimulus or when the stimulus is removed. An example of this process is the growth of muscles as a response to rigorous exercise. And then move on to the next part of the question regarding the responses to high altitude ecosystem. Introduce the stresses. First, define the high altitude ecosystems, the stresses like hypothermia and hypoxia. Give one or two examples of high altitude ecosystems where cultures are thriving, like the South American Andes, the Eskimos of Alaska, the Himalayan cultures, and explain each one of these stresses, hypothermia and hypoxia, in the context of physiological responses, developmental responses, and also regulatory, or as we call it, cultural responses to each one of them. And make sure that you are giving examples, especially when it comes to shelters and clothing, from the cultures like the Quechua of Andes in South America, shelters like the igloos of the Inuit of Alaska. And 6b, how are the cases of disputed paternity solved? And discuss the recent techniques. So essentially you need to capture all the techniques that have been used historically and also the ones that are being deployed in the contemporary times. So you can start by saying that one of the applications of applied physical anthropology is in the cases involving disputed paternity or doubtful paternity. Conventionally, blood types including ABO, rhesus, MNS were used. However, this method is very arbitrary, you see, and such blood groups were only about 40% effective in ruling out a man as a child's father. And since 1970s, testing for human leukocyte antigens, the HLAs, made it possible to rule out men as fathers with 80% effectiveness. And the genes responsible for HLA system are highly polymorphic, isn't it? With more than 3,000 different alleles which have been identified so far. And the vast number of alleles and associated genotypes in the HLA system makes it an ideal for consideration in identity and also paternity testing. Later in 1980s, electrophoresis method was used to identify biochemical markers like proteins or isozymes. What are isozymes? They are the different forms of enzymes. And these proteins or isozymes from a person's blood or any other tissue is taken, and electrophoresis methods were used, and any difference in isozymes relate to differences in alleles that code for these proteins. And the process of DNA fingerprinting was developed by Alec Jeffreys in 1984, and it first became available for paternity testing in 1988 when it was commercialized. And today, with the advent of DNA sequencing, amplification of the samples, PCR and the testing techniques, paternity testing has evolved even further than predicted. You know, the present day genetic testing has an accuracy of 99.99%. And the present techniques for paternity testing are using PCR, polymerase chain reaction, and RFLP, the restriction fragment length polymorphism. So briefly explain the concept and the steps involved in this case. So that is how you should tackle this question. And then 6C, critically evaluate Lewis Morgan's classification of family. So you can introduce by talking about Morgan. Morgan is an American anthropologist who was an evolutionist, and he showed different stages of evolution through changes in technology and political organization and kinship systems. In his work, that's Ancient Society, 1877, He presented his what he calls the ethnical periods and their subdivisions: savagery, barbarism, civilization, and each one of them having its own subdivisions. And he contends that the idea of family has been through successive stages of development in savagery, barbarism, and civilization. And then talk about the different types. The consanguine family, it was founded upon the intermarriage of brothers and sisters, which are own as well as collateral in a group. The Punaluvan family, and this was founded upon the intermarriage of several sisters, own and collateral, with each other's husbands in a group. The Syndiasmian or pairing family, he calls it. It was founded upon the marriage between single pairs, but without any exclusive cohabitation. And the patriarchal family, it was founded upon the marriage of one man with several wives. And finally, you have the monogamian family, founded upon the marriage between single pairs with an exclusive cohabitation. So explain each one of them briefly, and if you can give examples, that would be good. And you can conclude this answer by criticizing Morgan's theory of evolutionism in general, just about one or two. And then question 7a, critically evaluate different types of social stratification with suitable examples. Again, a straightforward question. So introduction should be the definition of stratification, which is the arrangement of people into layers, one above the other. Go on to explaining the societies using different and a combination of various criteria for like birth, wealth, power, occupation, etc. in order to stratify the people. These criteria can be ascriptive or achievement based. And you can say many types of stratification emerge actually, but the most universal ones are caste, class, estate, and gender. And define and explain the features of each of the systems of stratification. And this is a 20 marker, so you need to be a little more elaborate. And do not forget to include the examples while explaining them as the question demands. And question 7b, discuss the biosocial determinants of fertility and fecundity. Define and differentiate between fecundity and fertility first as an introduction. While fecundity is the physiological capacity or the biological ability to reproduce, fertility is the actual reproductive performance. While normal fecundity is a necessary prerequisite for fertility, an individual's fertility can be low or zero even while the fecundity is normal. And this demonstrates that not only biological but also some non-biological factors like social and cultural factors playing a role in determining the fertility of an individual. Then you can go on to explaining the various factors. There are many. These include age at marriage, contraception, nutrition, adolescent and postpartum sterility, breastfeeding practices, religion, demand for male line of descent, marriage regulations, etc. You can also follow the model of intermediate variables that were given by Kingsley Davis and Judith Blake as a paradigm to discuss the determinants also. You can use any model that you want. And 7c is again a 15 marker. What is anthropometry? Discuss its role in assessing the nutritional status and sports capability of a person. Start by defining anthropometry. What is it? It's the scientific method of measurements and proportions of the human body. Originally, it was a tool of physical anthropology, and anthropometry has many applications in different domains like designing defense equipment, clothing and furniture, and of course in assessing the nutritional status of individuals and the sports capability of a person. And then you can, under the nutritional status, you can say that 3 basic variables are used in the assessment, the nutritional assessment: height, weight, and age. And there are various indices or indices that are calculated. The weight height index, deficit in this particular index is wasting, and then height for age index, a deficiency in this index is called stunting. Weight for age index, the deficit here is underweight, and then you have the body mass index, BMI. Explain each one of them, the formulae, and don't forget to mention that the BMI is the only index that is used for adults, whereas the others can be used for children also. And in the context of assessing the sports capability, you can mention about kinanthropometry briefly, and the techniques to classify the different somatotypes, and also mentioning the classifications like the Coherocious model, slender type, medium type, and massive types. And while explaining, you can also mention Arnold's classification of gymnast, wrestler, and pentathlon types. And then you can conclude by mentioning that anthropology also helps in designing sports equipment to suit particular somatotypes to enhance the man sports gear interface for a seamless interaction. So anthropometry has multiple applications, and you can probably make a passing reference to them in your conclusion. And then let's move on to the last question, 8A, a 20 marker. And this is indeed a very humongous answer. Discuss the various tools of data collection in conducting anthropological research. I mean, normally you must be expecting the examiner to ask you 1 or 2 tools, but here the question is demanding much more than that. So you can start by briefly explaining the nature of anthropological research, which is scientific, empirical, and objective. And you can say that it's mainly an observational and a field-based science. There are many tools of data collection that are used. Explain all of them briefly, as you need to cover many of the tools. Observation, types including participant and non-participant. Interview, the types structured and unstructured. Schedules and questionnaires. Case study, genealogical method, life history, oral history. And you can also make a passing note on the secondary sources of information gathering if the research of the anthropologist so demands. And mention very briefly about the problems and disadvantages of every one of them wherever applicable. And that's a nice question to score good marks. And 8B, discuss the physiological and evolutionary theories of aging. So start your answer by defining aging, the gradual and spontaneous changes that occur in the maturation of an individual. Changes that lead to progressive functional decline or a gradual deterioration of the physiological functioning with age is what is called as aging. And different theories exist that explain the causes of aging. Explain the physiological theories that include the free radical theory, the endocrine theory, the immunological theory, the cross-linking theory, etc. And the evolutionary theories of aging. The evolutionary theories of aging basically hold that aging is a product of evolutionary forces, and it is not a biochemical or a cellular problem as it is maintained by the physiological theories. And these evolutionary approaches towards aging, they include the mutation accumulation theory. There's something called the antagonistic pleiotropy theory, and of course the origin theory of programmed death, which is originally given by August Weismann. And then you can conclude by saying that no one theory completely explains this complicated phenomenon, and many factors seem to be working simultaneously in the process. And then 8C, the last question, explain the structural analysis of kinship as proposed by Levi-Strauss. So introduce structuralism as the method used in anthropology, which is promoted by French structuralist Claude Levi-Strauss. The basic idea behind structuralism is that the individual and collective behaviors emerge from some underlying structure, which are more or less universal. And in the studies of structure of kinship, the systems derive from deeply rooted patterns of human cognition based on the logical opposition of the contrasting categories or the binary oppositions. And a contrasting category of kinship could be the relationship within different cultures of immediate family members, the consanguineous kin, and the affinal kin. And Levi-Strauss demonstrated the analysis of kinship through this work, which is famous, The Elementary Structures of Kinship. And he says that it is the universality of incest taboo that gives rise to alliance systems, the classification of kinship systems into elementary and complex structures, the differences between them. And while discussing elementary structures, he introduced the concept of restricted and generalized exchange and how they operate in the elementary structures. The cousin marriages, bilateral cousin marriages, unilateral, that's patrilateral and matrilateral cross cousin marriages. And cross cousin marriages in both the systems, and what are their characteristics and how they manifest, and how alliance ensures the solidarity between different groups. And do add a critique of his analysis in your conclusion. You have the sentiment hypothesis or the demographic hypothesis that have been given to explain alliance systems, in contradiction to what Levi-Strauss has given using his so-called structuralist method. So these are the points one should consider incorporating in the answers. We only looked at paper 1 in this video, and I'll come back to you soon with paper 2 in a different video. Till then, happy learning, and do take care of yourself and wish you all the very best.